Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is poet Edward Hirsch. He has published 9 books of poetry. The latest is Gabriel, a poem. Hirsch is also the author of 5 prose works, most recently A Poet's Glossary, a complete compendium of poetic terms. He's received the Prix de Rome, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Literature, and a MacArthur Fellowship. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in Poetry in 1985 and has served as president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation since 2003. On May 12, 2016, Hirsch gave a reading as the guest of the UO Creative Writing Program. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
I know from reading about you that one of the things that was important in your early career becoming a poet was to read the work of other poets. Who were some of the poets that you read early in your career that were really important to you, that really impacted your approach, your sense of yourself as a poet?
You and I are old enough to remember a group of critics called New Critics. No one knows
Yes,
what they are
indeed.
anymore, but New Critics are now a historical thing. My teachers were all New Critics when I went to college in 1968. And they taught us close reading. And they were followers of T.S. Eliot in particular, and so they loved the English metaphysical poets. And they taught me about those poets. And so those were the first poets that I first really came upon. I like the way that John Donne and Andrew Marvell and those poets made arguments. And it wasn't lost on me as an 18-year-old that a lot of those poems were seduction poems. And you know, that really spoke to me. That really spoke to me. And they were elaborate arguments. I liked those arguments. That was the first thing. Later on my own, like my sophomore year in college, I discovered the Romantic poets. My teachers didn't like Romantic poetry very much.
They were New Critics.
Exactly, but I was very enthusiastic. And it turns out that was actually more suited to my sensibility because of the excess of feeling in their work. So I fell in love with Keats and Shelley, Byron, then Wordsworth and Coleridge, and I just really fell for the Romantic. So I still love the English metaphysical poets and the way they construct poems. I like the idea of wit. But the feeling of the Romantics was closer to my own sensibility. Then I discovered the moderns, and I was on my way.
I know also that you started to read poets who were not originally writing in English, which wasn't typically what was getting taught by the New Critics. You started reading Russian poets, you started reading German poets, and those were also important to you, yeah?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me is that, I'll just say, it wasn't noble of me, but my teachers didn't know anything about it. I mean, if you wanted to learn about Russian poetry, you had to go to the Russian department. Right. If you wanted to learn about French poetry, you had to go to the French department. And there were sort of ghettos in that way. In the English department, they only talked about English literature. And this is a little complicated, but I had become, by the middle of my college life, a little disenchanted with Anglo-American modernism. It was, my teachers were all followers of Eliot and Pound, and their anti-Semitism really troubled me, and their coldness. They considered anything that they didn't like too sentimental, anything emotional. So by my junior or senior year, I started looking for something that was highly intellectual, but a little more emotional. And I stumbled upon Eastern European poetry in translation. I found the Russian poets, but I also found the Polish poets, the Hungarian poets, the Turkish poets. I was just really interested in all of this. And by my early 20s, I had really given myself to trying to find out about all these poets from different countries. It gave me just another viewpoint on poetry, and I've ended up being a strong advocate for international poetry. But it was really important to me. I just discovered something about poetry from reading these poets from other countries.
You say you're an advocate for international poetry. You're also an advocate for poetry in general. Why is that important? Why is poetry important?
Well, I'll just say that there's never been a culture without it. So the fact that there hasn't been a culture without poetry, just as there's never been a culture without music, suggests that there must be something in poetry and in music that are absolutely fundamental to how we exist as human beings. It's something we need. And so I like to think about what that is. Why is it that poetry is so important and so fundamental in culture and often so taken for granted? And here, I mean, where poetry is often pushed to the margins, I like to remind people that it may be pushed to the margins here, but it's been central to every culture that's come before us. And if we lose it, we lose something important. And I don't want us to be the ones who drop the ball.
It does work, and your most recent book, Gabriel, a poem, does some serious work. Tell us a little bit about that volume.
Well, this is a very particular thing. It's a book-length elegy for my son Gabriel, who died when he was 22 years old. It is literature. It does fall into the stream of the elegy, but it's very particular. It's a father's book. It's a grief-stricken book of a father mourning his son, which is outside the order of things, which is usually, we think of mourning people who died before us, who are older than us, which is sad, but something we understand has to happen. But mourning someone who's younger than you is completely outside the order of things. And so I decided to go all in and write a book-length poem about Gabriel.
In one of your prose works, the most recent prose work, A Poet's Glossary, which is a monumental 700-page glossary of poetic terms. It's an amazing and wonderful book, and it's a great gift to those of us who are students of poetry. You have, among all the other terms, elegy is one of the terms you define, and your definition or your entry says in part, the elegy does what Freud calls the work of mourning. It ritualizes grief into language and thereby makes it more bearable. In the light of your experience, do you think that would you modify that definition? Do you think that that it holds in your case, that definition of elegy, that did it ritualize through language your mourning and make the death more bearable?
It gives you something to do with your grief, to write a poem and to read a poem. It gives you something to think about besides your own sadness. And it is a work to try and take your experience and turn it into language. And that is somewhat distracting. You know, at one time, as you know, I spent my life as an advocate for poetry. I believed that poetry could do everything. And now I no longer believe that. I'm a little humbled by my own experience. I think that poetry can do some things better than almost anything else in the world can. But it can't return to you the people that you've lost. It can't do that work. It does some work. I don't know anything better than poetry in terms of ritualizing grief and in terms of mourning, but there are some things it can't do. And what it can't do is give you back the people you've lost. It can only give you words for your experience.
Well, one of the things that this volume does, among the many things that this volume does, is it gives us a striking sense of the person who was your son, of Gabriel. There's one poem, Mr. Impulsive. Would you mind reading that to us?
My pleasure. One of the most important things of why I wrote this poem was not because I wanted to write an elegy, but because I couldn't stand to have Gabriel be forgotten. He left a very small mark in the world, but he left a tremendous mark on a few of us. And I wanted people to know what he was like. So partially it's a father's book of grief, but partially it is a portrait of Gabriel. And I'll say in this section especially, but in many others, he was funny. And so part of his antics comes through, and that's part of the book that gives me the greatest pleasure, really. This part is a bit mordant, because I nickname him Mr. Impulsive. Mr. Impulsive walked out of class when he did not like what the teacher said. It was boring. Mr. Impulsive scurried out in a storm wearing shorts and a wife beater. Soon he was shivering. The neighbors complained to the landlord, complained to me, but Mr. Impulsive could not be bothered to close the gate. Mr. Impulsive left the house without his keys. I don't know how many times he camped out on the front stoop. One night he convinced a neighbor to shimmy the lock with a credit card. He was never locked out again. Mr. Impulsive will not be sleeping at home. He'd rather stay out and crash wherever he finds himself at 5 a.m. He could be oddly well-mannered to the parents of his friends. He was usually welcome. From the notebook of Mr. Impulsive. It is better to sneak through a side door than to wait in line like a sucker. It is not necessary to get directions. It's much better to head out right now. Time doesn't matter. These were the antics of Mr. Impulsive, who never knew where he was going until he got there.
And one of the amazing things about this volume, and you say that, you know, he he wasn't known to many, but to a few he was very beloved. This is this incredible, the volume communicates a person of amazing spirit and amazing energy and dynamism. And the book utterly succeeds in that regard. It's quite astonishing how alive he becomes to your reader.
This was the most important thing about the whole thing for me, was telling his story, but even more than telling his story, capturing what he was like. And the thing that's the most, I have many confused and conflicted feelings about this book, but one of the things that makes me happiest is that people get a feeling for what Gabriel was like. And the antics, Gabriel's antics, and his humor, and the nature of his temperament, all of that is important to me. And so the fact that he comes through, that's gratifying to me.
Also interesting, though, is at the same time in the volume, you can be suspicious of the representational work of poetry. There's one poem in there where you reflect on the reductiveness of your effort to represent him. Would you read that poem as well?
Sure. I mean, it seemed important that, first of all, this is a father's book. I'm telling Gabriel's story, but I'm telling him from my point of view, not from his point of view, not from his mother's point of view, not from his friend's point of view. And I just think it's important to let people know that you're aware of that. And also, when you're telling anecdotes, especially about someone, you're kind of summing them up. And there's something necessary about it, but somewhat, I'm a little wary of my own process of doing that, because I'm making literary decisions too. And you're summing up someone's life. So I'm a little skeptical of my own project, even though I'm fulfilling it. And so that's what comes up in this. You'll see that I start to tell a story and then I break it off. From the storybook of bluster and bad judgment, from the annals of loneliness, from the history of kids he met on the street in special programs, it was dangerous to stay in Amherst. Lord of misadventure, I'm scared of rounding him up and turning him into a story. God of scribbles and erasures, I hope he shines through like a Giacometti portrait. I keep scraping the canvas and painting him over again, but he keeps slipping away. He was like a spider preyed on by other spiders and older insects. Sweet venom, his arrivals were swift and his departures sudden. I couldn't understand how he lifted the shower door right off its hinges. When Gabriel cooked, the flames rose too high and the fire alarm sounded. When the fire alarm sounded, he tore it off the wall and left the wires dangling.
The comparison to the Giacometti portrait is wonderful, because that's the sense you get, that Giacometti is always trying to capture that portrait, but always aware that it can never be done.
I love those drawings where they just keep scribbling over, and he tries to erase it, and then he keeps doing it over, and you see he keeps trying to get it right. Yeah. He keeps changing it. He can't quite get it right. But you get the feel in that, which I'm picking up, is the struggle to represent. And I think that's just tremendously honorable in Giacometti. And so that's why I evoke him.
One of the other things that's very interesting about the volume is the form of the volume. So just describe the form. It's a very consistent form, and then say why that form? How'd you come to that form? Why was it important?
First of all, the entire poem is written without punctuation. And I wanted to capture, it was not a literary decision at first, I wanted to capture something about Gabriel's impulsiveness. And I wanted a poem that, because he was always coming and going fast, and you could tell from his temperament that he's just constantly in movement. And so I wanted a poem that could do that could sort of follow his sudden mercurial temperament and changes. And I got the idea that I could write clearly without punctuation. And I also decided I wanted to go all in and do a book-length poem. But I didn't want it to just all go by so fast. So I had some things I wanted to do, which is to tell Gabriel's story, but I'm also a lyric poet, I'm not a narrative poet. And so I got the idea that I could section the poem, first of all, in 3-line stanzas. Here I was sort of echoing Dante's Terza Rima. And I love Dante's Inferno, and my first idea was I'd have 100 sections the way Dante does. I decided to cut that back later, but it seemed infernal. My poem seemed infernal to me that way. And then I got the idea that I would have 10 3-line sections, and each one would be a kind of poem, like the sections I've been reading to you. Mm-hmm. They're not exactly poems, but they have their beginning and an end, and they carry through something. And I found that by doing that, I could create the movement of a lyric poem, but also by moving from one to the other, I could then tell the larger story. It would allow me to go on tangents, to contain something, to move ahead in time and to move back in time, but also then to move and tell the story kind of chronologically. And so I really like John Barrowman's Dream Songs and the way those poems work both individually and as a larger group. And so I got the idea they wouldn't have individual titles. They wouldn't be exactly poems. I call them near poems, but they would then accumulate into a larger portrait.
There are also sprinkled throughout the volume reflections on other poets who have lost their children. Why was that an important part of the project?
One of the odd things is the primary part of this book is to tell Gabriel's story. And I'm aware that my own suffering is one of the subjects. At the same time, I was aware, and I am aware, that I'm not the only one that this has ever happened to. And I don't mean to privilege my own suffering, because a lot of people have suffered much worse, but I also wanted to honor it. And so in thinking about how to do this, how to inflect the story of other people who've lost children, I found myself, I can't write about all the people who've lost children, but I found myself turning to my people, in other words, other poets, and thinking about inevitably how they'd handled it and what they'd done. I didn't really do any research. I'd never thought of this as a group, but it's as if, once I started working on my poem, I started going through the Rolodex and thinking, who's written poems about having lost children?
And there are many.
There are a lot. There are a lot, especially, before the 19th century, because it wasn't uncommon for people to lose children because people lost so many children in childbirth. And so I thought that that would be an important submotif of how other poets had written about it. And then also going through this, I'd say, is a sort of minor subject of poets as parents and poets as children. This came out of a game I used to play with when I was young with my friends. I'd go, okay, who wrote the best poem about gardening? What are the best 5 poems about tennis? And then one of my things were, who were the worst parents in the history of poetry? And, my candidates that are in the book are Rilke and Akhmatova. Rilke because he skipped out on his daughter's wedding because he was working on the Duino Elegies, and Akhmatova because she couldn't bear to actually raise her son, and she dumped him on her husband Gumilev's parents. But anyway, this is also a way of reflecting on my own life as a parent and my own thinking about my vocation of poetry and my commitment to fathering and how they were often in conflict and how they often didn't go together. There's a very funny quote from John Barrowman, which is in my book, which is, "It is a mistake to marry with poets or to be by them." Of course, you can choose whether or not to marry with them, but you can't choose whether or not to be by them.
Your homepage features the following lines: "I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and hummed a song for nothing, how nothing came to me." Tell us about those lines. Why are they important?
The night that Gabriel disappeared, before I knew he had disappeared, I was working on a poem, and the poem is called Troubadour Song. And it was an imitation of the 12th century troubadours, who I think are the sort of fountainhead of European poetry. And that was the refrain, and I was working on it. And then when Gabriel went missing, I stopped working on my poem, but the poem, I'd been working on it for a few weeks, was almost done the night that he disappeared. And then for the year that, after he died, I worked on my poem on Gabriel. I'd forgotten about my poem Troubadour Song. After I'd finished Gabriel, I went back to see at one point what I used to work on, what I used to have. And I found that Troubadour Song, this poem, had been virtually finished. So I now think of it as, that's the last poem of my old life. And so that has a sort of personal significance to me. And also it has an odd prescient quality, which I didn't understand at the time. I was just trying to make this song in the style of the Troubadours with the idea of nothing coming to me. So that's why it's there.
There's one other passage I'd like you to read if you're willing, which is a reflection on the grieving process. That's a very powerful one as well.
This is important to me related to what we were talking about, which is I'm mourning, but I'm also aware that I'm not the only one who's mourning. And it came from an observation that I have that sometimes you walk around and you meet people and you think they haven't suffered very much at a certain age. And then you realize it's only because you haven't known them very well, and that everyone is carrying around something. And that's what I try to get at in this section about mourning. And that this section is important to me for that, because the book is about mourning, but also it's a recognition that other people are in it with me. I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path because there is no path. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, and time with its medieval chambers, time with its jagged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves, though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with him again, and then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief, I'm not ready for your heaviness cemented to my body. Look closely and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day.
It's clear from reading the volume that passage in particular makes it clear that the experience has taught you something more generally about grieving and mourning and about how human beings do it and about how they can endure it. Is there one thing that you would say that you've learned that's been the most educational for you as a general thing, that's more from your experience but also generally about that necessary, unavoidable reality of grief and mourning and loss?
There's a wonderful writer who was much older than me, a dear friend who I loved, a fiction writer named William Maxwell. And William Maxwell liked to quote something that Henry James said. There are three important things in life: kindness, kindness, and kindness. I think that this has just brought it home to me about other people, that to try and be compassionate to yourself and compassionate to other people, because people are really going through things, you're just not aware of it. And so kindness towards others is something that's just come back to me with a kind of vengeance.
Since you've gone through this process, I know early in the process you were not able to read poetry, you were not able to write poetry, you eventually were able to write poetry. You finished this volume. Are you writing poetry?
I'm trying. I'm not writing about Gabriel per se right now, but I am sort of picking up an argument in the book, which is a quasi-Jewish argument with God, which is, I don't believe in you and I'm enraged with you. And turns out that argument is very, very Jewish. I have a friend who's a rabbi, and I said, yes, the problem is I just don't believe in God. And she goes, yes, that's a very Jewish position. So I've written some poems. I have a poem called God and Me. I have another called God and Me Continued, which just carries on the questioning and the subject matter of longing for something that you don't believe exists, but it's hard to give up, some consolation. And that argument, my poem, Gabriel, is very inconsolable. And it carries on the kind of argument of inconsolability with some longing for consolation and for some longing for permanence.
Have you returned to the classroom since
Yes. I have a permanent job running the Guggenheim Foundation, but I teach in the MFA program at NYU. part-time. I really love to teach. I really like to talk about poetry, so I teach graduate students in poetry.
Has that been helpful to you to return to teaching?
I just really like to do it. I mean, I don't think it's spiritually helpful, but maybe it is. I really like to talk about poetry, and I like to talk to young poets, and I like to teach them poetry, and I like to bring a lot of different poets that they haven't heard of to them. So yes, I think it is helpful.
Do you think that you're a different kind of teacher now?
I'm not sure about that. I think getting older maybe makes you a different kind of teacher. I'm not very interested in impressing my students, maybe it's the way I was when I was young with how much I've learned. I'm maybe a little more compassionate towards them as people, whereas before I was just a machine for, I mean, I always had some of this, but how much they know is not as crucial to me as it once was. Trying to communicate more clearly to them is maybe more important, but I don't think this is particularly related to my experience with Gabriel. I think it's an experience of teaching poetry over a long period of time.
So we have a minute and a half left. This will be the last question. Are there any young poets that you've recently read or that you're reading that you'd like to recommend, that you think we should read?
There are many, many, many.
Choose any.
One of my former students is named Olena Kalitak Davis. I think she's a terrific poet. I think there's a very gifted young poet named Kate Marvin who I like terrifically. I like this new kid, Ocean Vuong, who's really interesting young poet. I think that there are kids doing some really interesting thing, although some of these kids are 40 and 50 now.
Well, poetry is alive and well.
Yes,
poetry's
poetry's thriving. Poetry's thriving.
Well, Ed Hirsch, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and thank you so much for talking with us about this amazing book. It's just an incredible piece of work.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with poet Edward Hirsch, author of a book-length elegy poem for his son, Gabriel. On May 12, 2016, Hirsch gave a reading as a guest of the UO Creative Writing Program. Thanks so much for watching.